Ladies and gentlemen, there's a curious thing about the way we love, the way we build bonds, and the way those bonds either shape us or shatter us. For centuries, human connection has been the single most powerful force behind both our greatest triumphs and our deepest wounds. Love, when it's aligned, creates empires, but when it fractures, it can become the most silent war, one where both sides fight not with weapons, but with memories, with silence, and with the echo of everything that could have been. Tonight, I want to talk to you not just about relationships, but about what happens when a relationship lives in the shadow of ambition, intensity, and relentless pursuit of something far bigger than either partner can contain. I want to speak about why some people, after being closest to that storm, quietly say, "I'll never go back." And not because of hatred, not because of bitterness, but because of something far more complex, something deeply human. The world looks at powerful figures and often sees only their victories. We see achievements, innovations, headlines, and dazzling narratives. But behind those narratives, there's a human reality, raw, unfiltered, and often unseen. When someone stands at the center of global transformation, their life becomes a gravitational force. Everything around them bends, shifts, and is pulled into orbit. For a partner, for someone who loves them, this is not just life. It's survival inside a star. What many people don't understand is that extreme ambition rewires not just schedules, but psychology. It turns ordinary moments into battlegrounds of priorities. Imagine a dinner table where love exists, but so does the weight of a world-changing mission. Imagine laughter interrupted by urgent calls, late night whispers replaced by the sound of ideas being built. When one person lives in a future that doesn't yet exist, and the other lives in the present, something delicate begins to tear. Not loudly, quietly, slowly, in the spaces between conversations that never happened. As a neuroscientist, I've spent years studying the effect of sustained stress, ambition, and asymmetrical emotional investment on the human brain. What I've found is that love under extreme pressure behaves like glass under constant heat. At first it looks fine. It even appears to strengthen, because shared challenges can bond people powerfully. But eventually, the microfractures begin. Small misunderstandings harden into emotional distance. Support turns into fatigue. Admiration transforms into quiet resentment. The human brain is wired for connection, but it is also wired for self-preservation. When a partner begins to feel invisible, not because they are unloved, but because they are outshined by the scale of a mission, their nervous system starts sending subtle warning signals. The amygdala, the emotional alarm center, becomes hypervigilant. The prefrontal cortex, which normally helps us regulate patience, begins to tire. What once felt like exciting unpredictability begins to feel like instability. There's a point, often unspoken, when a partner realizes they are no longer living a shared story. They are living inside someone else's. It's not an accusation. It's a quiet mourning. The mourning of a relationship that was once equal, now turned into a satellite orbiting a sun that will not dim. And this is where that whispered sentence emerges. I'll never go back, and not because they don't remember the love, but because they remember the cost. I've interviewed individuals, partners of highly driven visionaries, founders, leaders, public figures, who describe the experience with almost surgical precision. One woman once told me, loving him was like holding lightning in my hands. It was beautiful, it lit up everything, but it burned me slowly, and I learned to stop blaming the lightning. This is not a story of villains and heroes. This is a story of human nervous systems trying to survive intensity. And here's what science tells us: the brain thrives in environments of attunement. That means being seen, heard, mirrored, and emotionally held. When one partner is consumed by a mission, their capacity for attunement narrows. It's not cruelty, it's bandwidth. And emotional bandwidth is finite. We glorify obsession in our culture. We call it genius, drive, excellence. And indeed, some of the greatest human leaps have been born from this furnace of relentless focus. But obsession doesn't live alone. It takes things with it: sleep, presence, softness, stillness, and often, the quiet rituals that sustain love. For someone who lives alongside that obsession, life can feel like being in a beautiful room with the lights on. But the person they love is always looking out the window. Their body is there, their hands might even be warm, but their mind is galaxies away, building the future. Now, imagine living in that space not for weeks or months, but for years. Imagine every holiday, every dinner, every touch competing with a mission that refuses to rest. Over time, the emotional circuitry starts to shift. Partners adapt. Some bury their own needs. Others become silent cheerleaders. But slowly, the weight of that sacrifice starts to carve into their sense of self. I've spoken with former partners of people who changed industries, who said something strikingly similar. I lost myself while loving him. That's the real gravity we rarely talk about. It's not about infidelity, money, or public life. It's about self-erasure. The quiet way your identity dissolves when you're constantly standing next to something bigger than you. And when that happens, the brain does something remarkable. It begins to protect itself by pulling away. Emotional detachment is not weakness. It's a survival mechanism. It's the nervous system saying, I can't keep disappearing. A love can be extraordinary, but love without balance is a slow unraveling. And balance is almost impossible when one person belongs to a dream the other cannot touch. That's why, when asked if they'd ever return, so many former partners of extraordinary figures say no. Not because they didn't love, but because they refused to lose themselves again. There's another layer to this, the social lens. The world often places these partners on pedestals they never ask for. They are expected to be endlessly supportive, endlessly patient, endlessly proud, but behind closed doors, no pedestal holds when your voice keeps echoing into a room that's already full of noise. Many of these relationships don't end with a dramatic explosion. They end quietly, like a star burning out slowly, almost imperceptibly. One day, the partner looks around and realizes they're living in a house full of memories that no longer feel alive. That realization is devastating. It's also liberating. There's a common myth that if someone walks away from greatness, they must not have been strong enough to stay. But strength isn't staying in the fire forever. Sometimes, strength is walking out with what's left of your soul intact. And if we're being honest, truly honest, it takes enormous courage to walk away from a love that dazzles the world. Because you're not just leaving a person, you're leaving a narrative, a legend, a gravitational field. I want to share a story from my research that stayed with me for years. A woman married to a revolutionary figure told me this. People saw me as the lucky one. They thought I was living inside a miracle. What they didn't know is that every miracle has a price tag, and I paid it with pieces of myself. She said it with no hatred, only clarity. The clarity that comes when your nervous system finally exhales after years of holding its breath. Science backs this up in ways that are both sobering and deeply human. Long-term exposure to emotionally imbalanced relationships, where one person's needs dominate unconsciously, leads to measurable changes in the limbic system. Partners develop hyperarousal, sleep dysregulation, sometimes even somatic symptoms that mimic illness. They live in a state of emotional hypervigilance, waiting for their turn in a space where their turn rarely comes. And yet, despite the pain, there's a strange beauty in these stories, because most of these partners don't walk away bitter. They walk away awake. They say, I'll never go back, not as a curse, but as a vow to themselves, a vow to be whole again. In the public eye, these stories often get twisted. People want villains. They want dramatic endings. But the truth is quieter, far more human. Two people can love each other deeply and still be entirely wrong for the life one of them has chosen. Love isn't always enough to survive the weight of a world-changing vision. It's not about being too weak to stand in the storm. It's about choosing not to live in a storm forever. When I studied the neurobiology of burnout and intimate partnerships, I found something fascinating. There's a point, a threshold, where the partner's nervous system simply says, enough. It's not a conscious decision. It's cellular. The brain starts to rebuild boundaries. Emotional distance grows, not out of malice, but necessity. And by the time the words, "I'll never go back," are spoken, the detachment has already solidified deep inside. Here's what's remarkable. In many of these cases, the love itself remains. The partners I've spoken to still describe moments of brilliance, of joy, of admiration. But they choose to never return, because they finally understand that love without oxygen cannot breathe. When one person lives for their mission, and the other sacrifices their own, it's not just a relationship, it becomes a silent equation of loss. This understanding, this awakening, is not unique to a few. It's echoed across industries, across decades, across the lives of those who stood next to greatness and quietly carried the invisible cost. And tonight, as we explore this truth, I want us to hold it not as gossip, not as judgment, but as a mirror to how human connection really works under pressure. Because if love is to survive brilliance, it must have space to breathe. And when we look closely at how the brain navigates love under relentless intensity, the patterns are astonishingly consistent. Emotional safety is not a luxury. It is a biological requirement. When that safety erodes, even the most passionate love begins to fray at its neural edges. Oxytocin, the bonding hormone that makes touch feel warm, that makes a glance feel like a home, starts to lose its anchoring power. Cortisol, the stress hormone, takes its place, quietly corroding what was once effortless intimacy. Think of it like this: two hearts beating together, but one is always sprinting. The other tries to keep up until eventually, it's out of breath. The sprinting doesn't slow. The breathless one learns to sit on the sidelines, to observe the race they once ran together. And little by little, that shared heartbeat goes silent. This isn't the story of one specific relationship. It's the story of countless partnerships orbiting intense visionaries. Men and women who push the boundaries of possibility. It's a story as old as human ambition itself. History remembers the names of those who moved mountains. It rarely remembers the hands that steadied them in the dark. I once sat across from a woman who had spent over a decade next to a man who changed entire industries. Her voice didn't shake as she spoke. It was steady, almost clinical. "I loved him," she said, "but I was never first. I was never second. I was part of the infrastructure that made his dream possible, and I disappeared somewhere along the way." When you hear sentences like that often enough, you begin to understand that what breaks people isn't a single moment. It's the accumulation of small moments where they feel unseen. It's the thousands of times they bite their tongue, the hundreds of quiet nights spent next to a body that feels far away. It's the erosion of identity, one grain at a time, until they no longer recognize the person staring back in the mirror. The brain, in its brilliance, adapts to survive. Neural pathways that were once wired for connection slowly rewire for self-preservation. The partner who once stayed up waiting begins to sleep alone, in spirit, long before they sleep alone in fact. Their mirror neurons, once dancing with another's energy, grow still. This is why so many people, when they finally leave, describe the sensation not as rage, but as stillness. A kind of quiet they hadn't felt in years. That stillness feels like oxygen after years underwater. And once they taste it, they can't unfeel it. It's why the phrase, "I'll never go back," doesn't sound like rebellion. It sounds like breathing. We must also speak about power. Not the loud kind, but the soft, invisible power that flows in relationships around greatness. When one person's life is on display, when their decisions ripple across industries or nations, the partner often becomes the keeper of emotional stability. Their role shifts subtly from lover to anchor. And anchors, no matter how strong, eventually sink if they're never lifted. In psychology, we call this emotional role collapse. It's the moment when your identity is no longer a full self, but a support structure. And human beings, no matter how much they love, cannot thrive as a structure forever. What's striking is that many of these former partners didn't start with resentment. They started with awe. They fell in love with vision, with brilliance, with the fire that burned so brightly. And in those early days, it feels intoxicating. Their brains release dopamine in waves. Every late night conversation feels electric. Every shared dream feels invincible. But here's the thing about fire: it doesn't negotiate. It consumes everything in its path, including the person standing closest to it. And most don't realize they're burning until the smoke becomes too thick to breathe. I've spoken to people who describe the turning point with stunning clarity. It's rarely a fight. It's rarely an affair. It's often a quiet evening when they sit across from the person they love and realize they're no longer seen. Not because their partner stopped caring, but because their partner can no longer look away from the future they're building. There is a moment, it happens almost like a slow sunrise, when the partner decides that the greatest act of love they can offer themselves is to leave, to choose self-presence over someone else's gravity. And that is where those 5 words are born. I'll never go back. They don't mean they regret loving. They mean they won't trade themselves away again. From a neurological perspective, what follows is profound. People who leave high-intensity, high-visibility relationships often experience something we call cognitive recalibration. Their sense of time expands, their sensory input sharpens, their sleep improves, their cortisol levels drop. They describe colors seeming brighter, silence feeling fuller. It's as if the body, once clenched like a fist, finally opens. One woman told me, "I thought I missed him. But what I really missed was myself." That sentence holds an entire world of truth. We tend to think of love as something that completes us. But real love, healthy love, should not erase us. It should allow 2 complete people to build something larger together, without either one dissolving in the process. When love stands next to unstoppable ambition, it demands constant renegotiation of identity. And when that negotiation becomes one-sided, when one person gives, adjusts, bends, and the other simply keeps running, the fabric eventually tears. I want to be clear here, this isn't about blaming ambition. Ambition can be beautiful. It builds bridges, cures diseases, launches rockets, and reimagines what's possible for humanity. But when ambition lives unchecked inside a relationship, it doesn't just stretch the bond. It consumes it. This is why former partners of extraordinary figures speak not with venom, but with wary clarity. They're not trying to destroy a legacy. They're telling the world what it costs to stand next to it. And sometimes they're telling themselves too. In my field, I've spent years mapping how human attachment adapts under extreme conditions. We see similar patterns in the partners of soldiers, activists, inventors, leaders, people who give their lives to a mission bigger than themselves. The partner learns to exist in the margins of someone else's urgency. They learn to disappear in plain sight. But here's the powerful part: when they finally step out of that orbit, something extraordinary happens. The nervous system, once shaped by the rhythm of someone else's mission, begins to rediscover its own beat. The quiet becomes music again. Their laughter, once muted, returns. They remember what it's like to have their name at the center of their own story. And once that happens, going back is no longer an option. There's another dimension to this: the way the world reacts when a partner walks away from someone powerful. Society often struggles to understand that leaving a dazzling life can be an act of self-respect, not failure. People ask, why would anyone leave that? But they're asking the wrong question. The real question is, what did it cost them to stay? A power, when shared unevenly, creates silence. Silence around needs. Silence around pain. Silence around identity. And silence is where the self begins to fade. I've seen these partners rebuild, not in grand, cinematic ways, but in small, precise, human ways. A walk without a phone buzzing every 2 minutes. A dinner where the conversation doesn't orbit around the next world-changing launch. A laugh that isn't timed between crises. In neuroscience, we call this restoration of baseline. It's when the brain stops living in constant alert and starts living again in the simple rhythm of being. And it's beautiful. It's healing. For many, that restoration feels like coming home, not to a house, but to themselves. That's why the words, "I'll never go back," aren't about defiance. They're about finally having a home inside their own skin again. And yet, beneath this hard-won clarity, there's often a quiet tenderness. Because love, even when it ends, doesn't simply vanish. It leaves traces in neural pathways, in the limbic architecture, in the way the heart responds to certain songs or familiar scents. Many who leave still carry love, but now they carry it differently, as something they once experienced, not something they must lose themselves inside again. I've heard this tenderness expressed in 1,000 different ways. I don't hate him. I just can't disappear like that again. I'll always admire what he built, but I need to build myself now. I loved him, but I love myself more now. These sentences are not the language of bitterness. They are the language of reclamation, and reclamation is one of the most powerful acts a human being can make. Reclamation begins slowly. It doesn't always look heroic. It often looks like a single quiet morning when someone wakes up and realizes that they are no longer living in someone else's shadow. It looks like a breath taken without waiting for permission. A voice spoken without needing to compete with the roar of a mission that once filled every room. Over time, these small moments form a new foundation. One where they are no longer a supporting character, but the protagonist of their own story. This is the true heart of that vow, "I'll never go back." It is not a rejection of the past. It is a refusal to surrender the future. In many of the interviews and case studies I've conducted over the years, one theme emerges again and again. People who walk away from consuming relationships aren't trying to rewrite history. They're simply refusing to relive it. And there's something profoundly human about that. The human nervous system has a kind of memory that goes far deeper than words. When someone has lived for years in a state of emotional scarcity, where their needs are quietly minimized and their identity slowly eclipsed, the body remembers. The muscles remember. The heartbeat remembers. So when life finally shifts, when the noise quiets, and when they stand on their own, the memory of that scarcity keeps them grounded. It reminds them that going back isn't love. It's surrender. What's often misunderstood is how gentle their departure can be. We imagine breakups around powerful figures as explosive, public, or dramatic. But more often than not, the ending is private, quiet. A cup of tea gone cold on a kitchen counter, a half-packed suitcase, a note that says nothing cruel, just something final. A departure that doesn't need to justify itself anymore. Because by the time they leave, they've already said their goodbyes in 1,000 silent ways. Love, when it has lived through brilliance and fire, doesn't end in a single moment. It fades through nights of unmet glances, through conversations about everything but the relationship itself. It ends when hope no longer argues with reality. And what's extraordinary is what happens next. There is a period, sometimes brief, sometimes long, where the partner learns the language of their own soul. They start asking themselves questions they haven't asked in years. What do I want to build? What do I love? What does my silence sound like when it's not filled with someone else's noise? For some, this rediscovery is terrifying at first. Their identity has been so intertwined with another's that standing alone feels like standing in a vast, dark room. But slowly, light creeps in. New dreams replace borrowed ones. New rhythms replace urgency. And for the first time in years, the ground beneath their feet belongs only to them. That is when they understand the true meaning of their own voice. Not the voice that whispered reassurance in someone else's storm, but the voice that calls their name in the stillness. That voice is why they don't return. From a neurological standpoint, this is not simply emotional, it's structural. When someone reclaims themselves, their brain literally rewires. The neural networks that were shaped by someone else's orbit begin to stabilize around their own goals, values, and rhythms. Emotional regulation improves. Executive function strengthens. Creative thinking reawakens. I've seen people, months after leaving these high-intensity relationships, light up in ways that are almost startling. They describe it as coming alive again. One woman told me, "I didn't know how small I had made myself until I stood alone and realized how much space I could take up." That's not bitterness. That's rebirth. And perhaps that is the most profound part of this entire human story. Leaving doesn't always mean the end of love. Sometimes, leaving means the beginning of self-love. It's not easy to stand next to someone who has the power to move the world. It takes strength. It takes resilience. But it takes even greater strength to step away when that power begins to consume the self. And that is why, when asked if they would ever return, so many simply shake their heads with quiet conviction. Because once you have tasted your own freedom, even the brightest fire cannot lure you back into the shadows. We often celebrate the people who build empires, who change industries, who push the edges of human possibility. But we must also honor the people who walk away from that brilliance. Not because they couldn't stay, but because they finally chose to belong fully to themselves. Their courage is quieter. It doesn't make headlines. But it is no less extraordinary. I've always believed that love is not meant to be a cage, no matter how golden. It's meant to be a field wide enough for two people to run freely, side by side, not one in orbit and one in shadow. When that balance is lost, when one heartbeat drowns out the other, love becomes a story written by only one author. And no human soul is meant to live forever as a footnote in someone else's book. So when they say, "I'll never go back," what they are really saying is, "I finally remembered who I am." They are saying, "I choose to exist in full color." They are saying, "I choose myself," not as an act of rebellion, but as an act of reverence. And that is something deeply, beautifully, undeniably human. We often look at powerful love stories and imagine that staying is the ultimate proof of strength. But maybe the real strength lies in knowing when to let go, in understanding that love doesn't have to be eternal to be meaningful, in realizing that walking away isn't the end of the story, it's the beginning of your own. So tonight, I don't ask you to judge those who walk away from brilliance. I ask you to understand them, to see the quiet courage it takes to stand up after years of disappearing, to honor the way they choose to breathe again. Because in the end, the loudest transformations are not the ones that shake the world. They're the ones that happen inside a single heart learning to beat for itself again. And if there's one truth I've learned from studying the human mind, from listening to the stories behind closed doors, it's this: no matter how extraordinary the person you love may be, your own existence is not a supporting role. You are always meant to be the main character in your own life. When they say, "I'll never go back," they are not turning away from love. They are turning toward themselves. And that, ladies and gentlemen, may be the most powerful choice any human being can make.